Welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. This is a daily podcast that's going through the key chapters of God's Word. There's an old kid's toy called Jacob's Ladder. I never really understood what that toy is about, except that it's named after today's passage, which is nothing like a toy. Today we're going to study Genesis 28 and see that Jacob's Ladder is one more key chapter in the unfolding of God's plan for His people. So welcome to the Key Chapters podcast. It is an honor and a privilege to go through God's Word with you. Today we're going through Genesis 28, and I should probably let you know we're kind of bending the rules of this key chapter a bit here because we normally go through one key chapter per day, but the story of Jacob unfolds over the course of many chapters, and rather than giving a week to the story of Jacob, we're only going to take a couple days just to skim across his life. So if you've read Genesis 28, then you know how it starts, and you know it starts out with Isaac blessing his son Jacob and telling him to go to a place called Padan Aram to find a wife. But we're really entering the situation mid-story, and so to understand what's going on, we need to quickly skim Genesis 25, 26, and 27. So let's turn back to Genesis 25 and put this passage in its historical setting. At this point in Genesis, the records of the patriarchs are in full swing. God has covenanted with Abraham that Abraham would have descendants as numerous as the stars, they would live in the promised land, and through whom all the people of the world will be blessed. And yet, of course, Abraham and Sarah were unable to have children until she was 91 years old, and so God is going to have to perform a miracle, and He does, and He miraculously gave them Isaac. But the arrival of Isaac was not the final chapter of the story, and in Genesis 22, God tested Abraham by commanding him to sacrifice Isaac. And with that command, we saw Abraham respond with serene faith. Abraham recognized that this command meant God was going to do another miracle. He's already given them one miracle with the birth of Isaac, and if Abraham was to carry out that command, God would have to do another miracle. And so Abraham figures God's got this and set out to obey God. And the Lord did. He provided a ram for Abraham to sacrifice instead of his son. And so Abraham trusted the Lord, and he demonstrated the kind of nation that Abraham was going to establish. One built upon faith and obedience, and one where every person would be ransomed by a sacrifice provided by God. Well, as we go on in this story, by the time we get to Genesis 25, decades have passed. We've skipped over Genesis 24, where the Lord clearly provided Rebekah to be Isaac's wife. And here now in chapter 25, Isaac's 60 years old, and like Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah couldn't have any kids, and so therefore there was no human way for God's promises to be fulfilled. And if God was going to fulfill His covenantal promises to Isaac, then God would have to do something. And in chapter 25, He does. He provides them twins. So let's look at the birth of these twins in chapter 25. By way of just a quick run-through of this chapter here, if you glance down at verse 26, it says that Isaac was 60 years old when Jacob and Esau were born, and that means Isaac and Rebekah didn't have kids for 20 years. And so, back in verse 22, eventually Rebekah conceives, and she doesn't feel great. Turns out she's having twins. And in verse 23, the Lord says to her, "Two nations are in your wombs, and two peoples will be separated from your body. And one people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." And the key point of that verse is that the older shall serve the younger, which was a big deal back then because normally it was the other way around. Well, by and by, the twins are born in verse 24. And the first boy to come on out was Esau. And verse 25 says he was a red and hairy little guy. Now, Jacob came right along with him, holding onto his heel. But officially speaking, Esau was the firstborn. And therefore, in that culture, the moment he came out first, he possessed the birthright to one day rule the family. Okay, so the boys are born. Now let's fast forward to when Jacob and Esau were still young men in chapter 25. Verse 27 tells us their personality types. Esau was a skilled hunter, a man of the field. Jacob was a peaceful man who lived in the tents. Verse 28 also tells us some of the dynamics of the parental favoritism going on in this family. And just by the way, parents, don't do this with your kids. It says that Isaac loved Esau because it had a taste for game. Rebekah loved Jacob, doesn't say why. But this parental favoritism is not a good situation. And so as the story goes on, in verse 29, Esau, he's out in the fields. Jacob's in the tent cooking up a stew. In verse 30, Esau comes back and he says to Jacob, "Please let me have a swallow of some of that red stuff there." In verse 31, Jacob's like, "Sure, sell me your birthright." In verse 32, Esau stalls and says, "I'm going to die anyway, go ahead." In verse 33, he's like, no, I'm serious, swear. And so in verse 34, Esau agrees, and Jacob gives him bread and lentil stew. Now this probably seems like a silly thing that guys might do, but look what verse 34 says. "Thus Esau despised his birthright." Well, that's a surprise, and it sure is. But it sets the tone for how Esau's legacy begins to unravel. The next window into the unraveling of Esau's legacy is in Genesis 26 with the choice of Esau's wives. So let's look at Genesis 26, verses 34 and 35. Genesis 26:34 says, "When Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, the daughter of Beri the Hittite, and Basmath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they brought grief to Isaac and Rebekah." Now, aside from the problems of polygamy, Esau is marrying 2 Hittite women. Now, Hittites were descendants of Canaan, who were descendants of Ham. You might remember that Ham was the one who looked upon Noah's nakedness after the flood, and God did not covenant with the descendants of Ham or the people of Canaan. He covenanted with the descendants of Shem and the people of Abraham. And so these Hittite women were not from the people who were in covenant with God. And we need to consider the significance of this. Esau was a member of the covenant community that God had established through his grandfather Abraham and his father Isaac. But Esau wasn't just any old member. He was the next in line to be the patriarch. He was going to set the tone and the standard for the next generation of this nation that God is establishing through these descendants of Abraham. And here you have this future leader marrying someone who is not from the covenant. What kind of example is he going to be for his kids? Well, not a very good one. And so his legacy just continues to unravel. Well, let's go on to Genesis 27, where the wheels come completely off Esau's birthright. Going on to Genesis 27, in verse 1, Isaac's getting old. His eyes are too dim to see, so he calls over Esau. In verse 2, Isaac wants to bless Esau because he doesn't know when he's going to die, and he wants to transfer authority to Esau before he's dead. So in verse 3, Isaac tells Esau, "Go grab your quiver, go hunt for some food, come back, we'll cook up a meal, and I'll give you the blessing." Now, back then, the blessing by the head of the family was extremely important. These official blessing ceremonies would pass the authority from one generation to the next. They were often celebrated with a meal. But here's the thing. Isaac wants to do this, but why? After all, we just saw back in chapter 25, verse 23, that the Lord told Rebekah that Jacob would be the one who would receive the promise. Why wasn't Isaac on board with God's plan? Well, it seems like he'd rather follow the rules of the world regarding birth order and birthright rather than the revealed will of God. Perhaps he was just so trapped in the world's ways of doing things that even with God's prophetic message to him and his wife, he was just unable to get on board with God's agenda, or at least not for a little while longer. And so this is kind of a dysfunctional situation. As an example of the dysfunction of this family, in verse 5, Rebekah is listening to Jacob and Esau scheme for this ceremony to pass the baton to the next generation. So Rebekah's got her own scheme. And so in verse 6, when Esau goes out to the field, she goes and gets Jacob and she tells him what she just heard. And so in verses 7 and 8, she's schemingly saying to Jacob, "Jacob, listen to me. Go get me 2 choice young goats and I'll prepare your father's favorite meal. He'll think you're Esau and he'll bless you instead." Now, in verse 11, Jacob doesn't think this is going to fly. And he's like, "Esau's hairy, I'm not." In verse 12, he says, "If Dad touches me, he's going to see I'm not Esau. And not only is he not going to bless me, he's going to curse me." But in verse 13, Rebekah urges him, "Go do this." And so Jacob does what she says. He goes and he gets the goats. In verse 14, Rebekah makes this meal. In verse 15, she puts skins of the goats on Jacob. And in verse 17, she gives the food to Jacob and sends him on into Isaac. Now, in verse 18, Jacob goes into Isaac and says, "My father." Isaac's like, "Here I am. Who are you?" In verse 19, Jacob says, "I'm Esau, your firstborn here. Eat my game." In verse 20, Isaac asks him, how could he be back so quickly? And Jacob says this whopper of a lie. He says, "Because the Lord your God caused it to happen to me." That's a huge lie. In verse 21, Isaac is skeptical and he calls Jacob in close and he feels Jacob's hands covered with goat skins, and he says in verse 22 that the voice is that of Jacob, but the hands are that of Esau. And again, he asks in verse 24, "Are you really my son?" And Jacob gives this incredible lie again. "Yes, I am." I mean, technically he's his son, but he's certainly not the son that he's claiming to be. And so they go and they get this food and they have this ceremony where Isaac blesses Jacob, but thinking he's saying this to Esau, he says, "Now may God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and an abundance of grain and new wine. May peoples serve you and nations bow down to you. Be master of your brothers." And remember, Isaac is giving this blessing to the person who he thinks is Esau, but the Lord has already told him that Esau will be serving Jacob. And still he says, "Be master of your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be those who curse you, and blessed be those who bless you." And so here Isaac is giving Jacob the whole enchilada, and this blessing includes 4 elements. 1, agricultural prosperity in verse 28, respect and success, verse 29, authority for Jacob to be master over the family, verse 29, and a cursing and a blessing for those who would curse and bless Jacob. And so Isaac thinks he's giving this blessing to Esau, but he's really giving it to Jacob. So obviously this whole blessing is based on a lie. And Isaac eventually finds out what's happened. But then at that point, he doesn't rescind his blessings on Jacob. Instead, Isaac gives Esau a so-called blessing in verse 47, saying that Esau would be the one who would serve Jacob. And that now brings us to chapter 28, our key chapter for the day. These opening verses give us Dad's blessings and his counsel. Now, Isaac's counsel was for Jacob to not marry a Canaanite woman, but instead to go to Padan Aram and find a wife from among the daughters of Laban. And it's interesting to see that that's what Jacob does. And verse 7 says it was in obedience to his father and mother. Now, Jacob may be a deceiver, but he seems on board with the whole point of being separated from the world. Well, going on in Genesis 28, Isaac then gives Jacob a real blessing. And so in verses 3 and 4, Isaac says, "May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may become a company of peoples. May he also give you the blessings of Abraham to you and to your descendants with you, that you may possess the land of your sojournings, which God gave to Abraham." And so this blessing included two primary points: that God would make him fruitful and become a company of people, and that he would possess the promised land. And so it seems now at this point, Isaac is finally coming around to the fact that God has chosen Jacob over Esau. Now, in terms of the sequence of these events here, Jacob's whole deceptive goat skin wearing act has just happened. Understandably, everyone's ticked at Jacob and his brother Esau wants to kill him. So in verse 10, Jacob flees to a place called Haran, where his mom Rebekah was from. Haran is way up to the north and even to the east a bit on the southern edge of modern-day Turkey. And on that journey, the Lord met him in a dream, and this dream is why we're calling this a key chapter, because in this dream, the Lord gave Jacob the same kind of promises that he gave to Abraham and Isaac. Now, this dream is called Jacob's Ladder. I have no idea how that relates to the toy, and if you know, feel free to drop me a line. Either way, Genesis 28:11 says, "He came to a certain place and spent the night there because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones of the place and put it under his head and lay down in that place." It's never great when you have to use stones as pillows. And so in verse 12, "He had a dream, and behold, a ladder was set on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it." Verse 13 says, "And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give it to you and your descendants. Your descendants will also be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and in your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." Now, this should sound a lot like God's covenant with Abraham. Basically, it's just reiteration of the same covenant. And so here, God promises to bless Jacob, and he promises that he will give Jacob this land, that his descendants will be as numerous as the dust of the earth, and through these descendants, all the nations of the families of the earth will be blessed. But here's the key point. Aside from the fact that God has just reiterated his covenant that he's made with Abraham, notice who God is not making this covenant with. God is giving these amazing promises to Jacob and not to his older brother Esau. Now why? After all, Jacob is the guy who just gypped his brother out of the whole family inheritance. But if you were to jump to Genesis 33, verse 9, Esau does all right for himself, and anyone who knew him would say he got the birthright after all. But here we're seeing that the real birthright, the one that mattered, the one that would determine world history, came through Jacob by the promise of God. And so look at Jacob's response in verse 17. He's afraid and he says, "How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." And he makes an altar to the Lord and says in verse 22, "This stone which I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and all that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you." And so Jacob fully believes God's promises, and he is fully on board with establishing this nation, and he begins to change the way he lives in light of God's agenda for his life. And this is the kind of faith we saw in Abraham. It's not really the kind of faith we saw in Isaac. It's definitely not the kind of faith we saw in Esau. But Jacob receives this promise and it changes his whole life. And like his grandfather Abraham, Jacob shows us what it looks like to believe God's promises and live in light of them. Well, that's Genesis 28. Okay, that's Genesis 25 to 28. We've covered a lot of ground, so we'll just end things there. Thanks for listening. Have a great rest of your day. And until tomorrow, God bless. Hey, this is Russ again, and I've got another quick announcement I'd like to share with you. As you know, I've written a study guide on the book of Genesis that's available on Amazon, and today I'd like to announce a way you can get this book for free. You see, I wrote this book to help God's people better understand God's message. But I realize there are people who are listening to this podcast from around the world, and the book might not be available to them for various reasons. And so I'm pleased to say that you can now get nearly the entire book for free as a devotional guide on the YouVersion Bible app. It's got nearly everything there, just it's missing the opening material and the closing material. If you go to their plans section and you search for key chapters of Genesis, this book should just come right on up as one of their plans. You can just read almost the whole thing again for free. Now you might be wondering, what is the YouVersion Bible app? That's actually the app that comes up first when you search for Bible in the Android and iTunes app stores. I think they're always first, and as a couple of years ago, they were on over 450 million devices, and so you may have seen it, and you may have even already had it installed on your phone, and in fact, you might have heard of this podcast through there because for a while they had a podcast section. We were one of the 15 podcasts that they would support. It's got that little logo. It's a maroon Bible that says Holy Bible in it, and so it's super common, might be on your phone already. Anyway, if you open the app, they've got a little section on the bottom called Plans for like reading plans, devotional plans, things like that. It covers a variety of material. And if you go to their plans section and you search for key chapters of Genesis, the book should come right on up. So again, it's almost the whole book for free. You don't have to live in America or even buy the book to benefit from it. It's available on YouVersion for free, or of course, it's also still available on Amazon as well if you want to have it in print form. I hope you check it on out, and thank you to everyone who has bought the book already. I hope it's been a blessing to you. Thanks again. Have a great day, and God bless.